in demanding of Muslims and other minorities the subordination to, and total identification with, a Hindu Rashtra, Upadhyaya, while his reasons differed in both premise and approach, arrived at the same place as Savarkar and Golwalkar. But Upadhyaya went a few steps beyond them in developing more fully the concept of what a Hindu Rashtra might consist of. In building his case for a Hindu Rashtra, Upadhyaya specifically disavowed the existing constitution of India, which makes all the more curious the enthusiastic zeal with which his devotees today, from Prime Minister Modi on down, swear by it and celebrate every milestone in its adoption. As Upadhyaya put it in Rashtra Jivan Ki Disha, we became free in 1947. The English quit India. We felt what was considered to be the greatest obstacle in the path of our effort of nation building was removed, and were all of a sudden faced with the problem as to what the significance of this hard-earned independence was. Indian leaders tried to resolve this problem in the drafting of a constitution. But in Upadhyaya's view, their failure to conceive properly of the nation led them into error. We aped the foreigners to such an extent that we failed to see that our inherent national ideals and traditions should be reflected in our constitution. We satisfied ourselves with making a patchwork of theories and principles enunciated by foreign countries. The result was that our national culture and traditions were never reflected in these ideologies borrowed from elsewhere, and so they utterly failed to touch the chords of our national being. Having rejected its premise, Upadhyaya was scathing about the Constitution's drafting and adoption. A nation, he argued, is not like a club which can be started or dissolved. A nation is not created by some crores of people passing a resolution and defining a common code of behavior binding on all its members. A certain mass of people emerges with an inherent motivation. It is, he added, using a Hindu analogy, like the soul adopting the medium of the body. 51. In the classic Hindu formula, a king must function according to his Raj Dharma, or code of governance, which is not defined by him, but is laid down for him by selfless unattached rishis. In contemporary language, Upadhyaya saw a Hindu king almost as one might a chief executive receiving his authority from the shareholders, in this case, the people, mediated through the vision of the board, in this case, the wisdom of the sages. Observing that the Constitution requires that any person holding a position of power has to take a pledge of loyalty to that Constitution, Upadhyaya asks three questions. Were the people who framed the Constitution endowed with qualities of selflessness, an intense desire for public service, and a deep knowledge of the rules of Dharma as the rishis were? Or did they formulate the smriti of a free India under the influence of the unsteady circumstances prevailing at the time? Did these people possess originality of thought, or did they have a tendency to primarily imitate others? Upadhyaya's implicit answers to these questions were in the negative. The constitution makers were not figures imbued with selflessness and dharma. They were overly enthralled to the turbulent politics of that era, and their minds had been colonized by Western ideas. The founding fathers of the Republic of India were largely Anglophile Indians schooled in Western systems of thought. Their work revealed no Indianness, no Bharati Yatha. The Constitution, therefore, was to him a flawed document, one incapable of guiding India towards the path of Raj Dharma. In fact, it condemned Hindus to slavery. Self-rule and independence are considered to be synonyms. A deeper thinking will bring home to us the fact that even in a free country, the nation can remain in slavery. The Hindu nation had been enslaved by inappropriate westernization. Even the language in which the Constitution had been drafted betrayed this reality. If the original draft of the Constitution had been in Hindi or in any other Indian language, he felt, the un-Indian element would not have been as dominant. But his concerns, of course, went well beyond language. The Constitution's core conception of the nation, in his view, was fundamentally not Indian at all. In the Constitution, as it is now, it is the sentiments of the English that have found better expression than those of the Indians, observed Upadhyaya. Thus, our Constitution, like an English child born in India, has become Anglo-Indian in character, instead of purely Indian. 52. Upadhyaya thus questioned the very legitimacy of the Constitution and not just the process by which it was created. For Upadhyaya, the absence of the Hindu Rashtra idea in the Constitution was unacceptable. For him, Dharma had to be the central idea behind governance and nation building. He categorically repudiated the secularists' view that Dharma is an entirely personal matter, that it had nothing to do with society or nation. On the contrary, Upadhyaya argued that there is undoubtedly a supreme purpose to life, which transcended all differences and peculiarities of caste, sect, or language. This purpose is not a worldly one. It does not consist of seeking to erect a huge political empire or to dominate the world militarily. Indeed, militarism and temporal power, Upadhyaya wrote, were not a Hindu preoccupation. Hindus had never shed the blood of other peoples or perpetrated atrocities on other countries as Alexander, Genghis Khan, Mahmud of Ghazni, non-Hindu conquerors all had done. Hindus had, instead, always given a warm welcome and shelter to refugee groups like the Parsis and the Jews, who had become the victims of aggression and atrocities elsewhere and had fled to India. In keeping with his distaste for foreign concepts and terms, Upadhyaya explicated his beliefs through the use of Sanskrit terms to which he ascribed specific contemporary meanings. A favorite word of Upadhyaya's is chiti, which he labels the soul power of a nation. He describes this soul power through a homely analogy. A barber told his customer that his razor was 60 years old, and had been used by his father. Upon further scrutiny, the customer noticed that over the years the handle and blade had been replaced many times, but the barber still claimed that the razor was the same as used by his father. It was a point of pride and prestige for him. The essence of the razor was unchanged even if its physical trappings had been altered over the years. Every nation also had such an identity that did not change with circumstances and temporal alterations. Sadly, modern India, the democratic republic that had emerged under the Constitution, had no sense of its chiti. One example of this was in the country's constitutional structure. Upadhyaya saw the seeds of division. For instance, even in the Constitution's decision to rename the provinces as states as the Americans did, this reduced India to a federation of states, a dangerously divisive concept in his view. Upadhyaya acknowledged that, unlike the United States, every Indian state did not have its own constitution and that there was only one citizenship for the entire country, but he felt the formulation envisaged in the Constitution diluted the sacred idea of a unified Bharatvarsha, Indian subcontinent. The Constitution should have spoken of a unitary state rather than a union of states. The soul of Bharat was missing. He seemed unconscious of the argument that it was precisely because of these states and their linguistic basis that unity was achieved, for India was able to accommodate all its diversities and give them political expression without losing the bigger cause of united nationhood. Surely this was a way of preserving, not diluting, Bharat's Chidi. Accompanying Chidi is another force that Upadhyaya called Virat Shakti, literally immense strength or power, but more precisely a scientific term, in his words, with a definite connotation. So long as the Chidi is throbbing and pure, the nation continues to prosper. It is the spirit of Chidi that creates Virat Shakti, the organized and unified fighting strength that protects the nation from aggression and dissension. While Chidi is the soul of a nation, Virat Shakti is its life force. Of course, neither idea is even implicitly present in India's constitution, underscoring, for Upadhyaya, its deeply flawed nature. Upadhyaya worried that India's constitutional system had been created in negation of its true inherent national spirit, and that if the modern Indian nation continued in this way, Hindu civilization would perish. This is what had happened, after all, to Greece and Egypt, whose modern incarnations bore no relationship to the ancient civilizations from which they claimed descent. The same stock of people might be living in those countries, but they bore no resemblance to their glorious past civilizations or forebears. Indeed, the essence of their society, its identity, had changed. This was the fate that Upadhyaya feared would befall India if it continued down the secular west-east path charted for it in its constitution. It would lose its core identity, which lay in the form of its Chidi, and in effect become something other than the continuing Bharatiya civilization that could trace its origins back to the mists of time. Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, Chandra Savarkar, and Golwalkar accepted that the India of which he was writing had to accommodate its Muslims and Christians too. He rejected the notion that the Hindu Rashtra would have to mean a theocratic state propagating the Hindu religion. Upadhyaya was conscious that his critics associated the very establishment of such a Hindu state with the revival of the ritualism associated with the Hindu religion, notions of casteism and inflexible social hierarchy, and the return of discrimination and social inequality. No, he insisted, his Hindu Rashtra was not based on hatred against any community, nor was it reactionary. Rather, his Hinduism would be inclusive. As a Hindu, Upadhyaya averred that he was not opposed to the Muslim and Christian modes of worship. Indeed, he never criticized the prophets of either faith. He believed that how to worship God, and which God to worship, was each person's personal choice. The state had no role in such considerations. His quarrel, he explained, was not with any sect or mode of worship, it was purely political. Upadhyaya said that he respected other religions, while arguing that the problem of Muslims and Christians was not religious. Gandhiji had tried religious syncretism, singing bhajans to the effect that Ishvar and Allah were the same, but political unity between the two communities had not followed. The issue therefore was one of political commitment to the country and its values, not with the practice of religious faith or with the goodness of any individual. Every society, after all, has good and bad people. Upadhyaya reminded his listeners that Muslim generals had fought in the armies of Shivaji and the Peshwas. He had high praise for Muslim patriots among his contemporaries, singling out as examples Mohammad Karim Shigla, the highly cosmopolitan, secular jurist and diplomat, Hamid Dalwai, a crusader for reform within the Muslim community, and the revolutionary Ashfaqullah Khan. But these men, Upadhyaya said, were individuals. Their personal behavior did not warrant any conclusions about the mind and attitudes of the Muslim masses. If all the people in the Muslim community were like Shigla, Upadhyaya once opined, then there would be no problem whatsoever. But they were not, and quoting a few rare examples of good persons would not solve the problem. This distinction between a few good Muslims and a problematic Muslim community was central to Upadhyaya's misconception of Muslims in India. He assumed a monolithic Muslim community when in fact Muslim practices across the country were also hugely diverse, and a pan-Indian Muslim identity of the kind he suggests did not exist. Still, in making these points, however tokenistically, Upadhyaya was undoubtedly going beyond the exclusively Hindu Rashtra advocated by the earlier Hindutva ideologues. He was willing to acknowledge that the inhabitants of this country included Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Parsis, and others. But he saw communal unrest in terms of the aspirations of various communities to establish their political domination in particular geographical areas, just as Jinnah had led the Muslims to the creation of a separate state hostile to India and venomous in its denial of India's historical nationalism. To fulfill these aspirations, Upadhyaya argued, each community sought an increase in its numerical strength to strengthen its hands. This is why these communities behaved as they did. Muslims rejected family planning and monogamy, while Christians, supported by foreign agencies and news media, carried on systematic conversion campaigns. Christian missionaries had undoubtedly, Upadhyaya wrote, made a determined effort, under the patronage of the British imperialist government, to wean away Hindus from their traditional culture, but their attempts at conversion were not as fanatical or violent as those of the Muslims. Still, such practices had to stop. These problems could be contained if a Hindu Rashtra were established. The critics of Hindu Rashtra, Upadhyaya argued, found that the term was inexpedient for them in the country's competitive politics. They were afraid of losing millions of Christian and Muslim voters. Their misconception was that the use of the term Hindu Rashtra excluded Muslim and Christian communities. If both these communities became one with the national cultural mainstream without any change in their modes of worship, they would be welcome in the new India. All they had to do was to own up to the ancient traditions of India, to look upon Hindu national heroes as their national heroes, and to develop devotion for Bharat Mata. Then they would be fully accepted as nationals of the Hindu Rashtra. In affirming this view of India's political identity, Upadhyaya was in effect returning to the Savrakargal Walker home base. His political inclusiveness was illusory, for the terms in which it was formulated, despite the seeming openness to other forms of religious worship, left no room for anything but submission to Hindu dominance. However, to be fair, in other aspects of his political philosophy, especially in relation to the economic needs of the underclasses, Upadhyaya demonstrated a more substantive inclusiveness. Rather like Gandhi, Upadhyaya believed in Swaraj, self-governance, visualizing for India a decentralist polity and self-reliant economy centered on its villages. But there was a more profound consequence of this approach. He eschewed the label of socialism, but expelled 7 of the 9 Malays his Jan San party had in Rajasthan for opposing the Zamindari, big landowner, Abolition Act piloted by the Congress to cut large land holdings down to size in the name of socialism. Individual freedom in a democratic system, he argued, enabled the rich to monopolize production, gain economic power and influence government machinery. Upadhyaya deplored the fact that Indian villagers had lost their jobs to large factories. Socialism, he said, was an understandable response to the exploitation of the masses in the industrial age. Still, he considered himself a political opponent of the socialists. Both socialism and capitalism, Upadhyaya argued, concentrated their attention on man's material aspirations and on the fulfillment of his gross desires. Both had implicit faith in modern science and technological progress. To Upadhyaya, the nature of production had come to be determined not by the needs or the welfare of human beings but by the nature and demands of machines. He wanted modern technology to be adapted to suit Indian requirements. In a centralist system of production, whether capitalist or socialist, whether under individual or state control, man's individuality is lost and he becomes a mere cog in the machine. Instead of bringing about human development by striking a balance between the material and spiritual needs, both systems have only created conflict. The answer lay in focusing on the human personality as a whole, and in creating a system that balanced competition with cooperation and harmonized material progress with spiritual advancement. This Upadhyaya dubbed integral humanism. In contrast, it is suggested, with the former communist leader M. N. Roy's theory of radical humanism, but also, I imagine, borrowing from Sri Aurobindo's integral yoga. The philosophy of integral humanism advocated the simultaneous and integrated functioning of the body, mind, intellect, and soul of each human being. The philosophy of integral humanism was a synthesis of the material and the spiritual, the individual, and the collective. It answered what Upadhyaya saw as the urgent need in India for a fresh breeze. He adumbrated this philosophy to some 500 party workers in 1964, developed it into an expanded version at the Janassan Party's plenary session in 1965, and expounded it finally and fully in the form of 4 lectures in Bombay, titled Integral Humanism. The impact was strong and lasting. Upadhyaya's integral humanism was adopted by the Janassan as its official doctrine and has subsequently been inherited by the BJP, whose leaders treated with the reverence a Lutheran accords to those famous theses nailed to the cathedral door. Upadhyaya believed that humanity, in all its infinite diversity, had a common ethos or soul, which the ancient Hindu texts defined as Atman. The apparent diversity is superficial, the essential unity is profound. This is the idea of Ekatmata, or the unifying soul that pervades the world. Man is a conglomerate of body, mind, intellect, and soul. All 4 had to develop and thrive for society to progress. While material development was necessary, spiritual development was also indispensable. This was why Bharatiya culture had placed 4 objectives, Purusharthas, before every individual, which each of us was to pursue. The fulfillment of these goals occurred in society, since Ekatmata ensured that individual and society are mutually complementary. The desire for the welfare of humanity comes from that consciousness of unity. When an individual acts in the awareness that he and society are one Atman, his actions will be conducive to the common good. Systems that regard an individual as self-centered are defective, he argued, because they fail to take this into account. The ideal man, to Upadhyaya, views life through the 4 Purusharthas and works for their fulfillment. If everyone did so, in keeping with Bharatiya Advaita philosophy, whereby the good of the individual would coincide with the good of society, internal contradictions to achieve these ideals would be replaced by cooperation and compatibility. This conviction required a leap of faith, the idea that the individual pursuing artha, material prosperity, for instance, would always do so selflessly in ways that would serve society collectively, did not seem grounded in practical experience. Upadhyaya dissected what he saw as the failings of other prevailing systems before affirming the integral humanism of Bharatiya culture, which provided a unified view of the universe. The balanced pursuit of the Purusharthas would ensure that happiness was pursued across all four. Man would not just gratify his senses but also seek mental, intellectual, and spiritual happiness. Upadhyaya laid the greatest emphasis on the happiness of the soul. All other kinds of happiness, he believed, are derived from union with the soul. Thus Upadhyaya took a stern view of those who saw artha as an end in itself. An excessive attachment to affluence, he felt, reduces man to a mammon worshipper who loses all sense of duty to his society, country, and dharma. Similarly, kama cannot be reduced to carnal pleasures at the expense of other priorities. Dharma is key since it ensures the maintenance and development of the people in harmony with the progress of society. Dharma went beyond the literal concept of religion and was not merely for Hindus. Indeed, all places of worship, whether temples, churches, or mosques, should instill in the populace the practice of Dharma. All four Purusharthas are codependent, and together form a path to moksha. If a man is properly assembled as a function of the four Purusharthas, so will society be successfully constructed. When an individual starts on the path of fulfilling his Purusharthas, he comes into contact with a larger group of people, develops the willingness to work for others, and experiences shared joy and mutual understanding. Families, communities, and nations are born of this. But the excessive individual freedom of the capitalist West and the collectivization of the communist East had eroded this consciousness, which was now under threat in India. For Upadhyaya, the Western theory of the social contract had to be rejected, for society is not a club that individuals can seek membership in. Society, Upadhyaya writes, in terms similar to his conception of a nation, is not an institution created by individuals coming together. A society is born. The relation of a society to its individuals is the same as that of an organism and its limbs, or that of a tree and its branches, leaves and flowers. The question of who is more important of the two, society or individual, is not worth considering. 53 In Bharatiya culture, we can neither ignore the individual nor lose sight of society's interests. Society is a living organism, and has its own mind, intellect, and soul. Thus, it must have its own Purusharthas. The Samashti Dharma, Dharma of society, embraces all that helps sustain the individual and the society. When applied to Bharat, it involves guarding the bonds of affinity to the motherland, an amalgam of common history, culture, clothing, and creed. The Artha Purushartha of society should be against prabhav, social bifurcations through granting high social status to the rich, as well as against abhav, or dependence on other nations. Thus self-reliance and egalitarianism are vital. The Kama Purushartha of society embodies the nation's desires, such as the restoration of an undivided Bharat, or the expulsion of China from Indian territory, and the protection and spread of Indian culture. The Moksha Purushartha of society would imply freedom from foreign domination, through cultural, economic and political freedom. This would make India a well-organized, powerful, and wealthy Hindu nation, based on Hindu values of nonviolence, literature, and culture. The Purusharthas are not just objectives, but constitute bonds between the individual and society, which are connected by education, work, enjoyment, and yajna or sacrifice. A man's yajna requires that the work should not be done for himself, but for society. Thus a farmer grows corn not just for himself but for society, and work done with a sense of duty and sacrifice becomes beneficial to society. Society has obligations to the individual too. If society fails to provide an individual with a good education, and he or she is unable to get an adequate job to sustain himself, society has failed him. However, if after receiving a good education, the individual does not work for society, he would have neglected samashti dharma, the dharma of society, and been morally degraded. Society and the individual are therefore complementary, and stand together by following dharma. When this does not happen and the underlying unity is lost, conflicts arise between privileged castes and untouchables, industrialists, and workers and so on. The greatest blunder our politicians make, Upadhyaya argued, is their assumption of the existence of inherently and basically different classes, social, political, linguistic, with different interests. The truth is Bharat is one country, its subjects are one and have to live as one people. Antudaya, service of the poorest and least fortunate in society, was a Hindu obligation. Minority appeasement, and for that matter class distinctions, has no place in such a vision. Nor did Upadhyaya shy away from facing the challenge of Vyavastha, which he translates not as the caste system but as the class system. Upadhyaya opposed both those who believed that Varna Vyavastha is God-made, that people are born into castes on the basis of their past lives, and those who pretend to use ideological opposition to caste to garner political power. Upadhyaya asserted that Varna Vyavastha was introduced to fulfill the needs of society, by requiring each individual to do what he can do best. In the past, the valiant came forward for defense, the studious for advanced knowledge and to teach. There was no superiority and inferiority in the system, merely capability. Varna Vyavastha was based on the view that a society is an organic whole. Its purpose was to bring physical and spiritual happiness within everybody's reach. Upadhyaya's philosophy did not stop there, but extended from samashti to paramishtha, society to God. Bharatiya culture, after all, does not end with humanity, but includes all naturally occurring things in creation: flora, fauna, air, water, sunlight, animals, rivers, planets. The Bharatiya Advaita philosophy begins at the family, encompassing humanity, the animal world, plant life, the inanimate world, and stops at nothing short of the universe. Thus the philosophy of integral humanism envisages, in the words of an admirer, an ennobling expanse of human consciousness. Unlike Western social and political theories, Upadhyaya stressed, integral humanism did not emerge as a reaction to any particular circumstance and was based on positive thinking. If by nature man is such that he does not mind fighting with others to enrich himself at the cost of others, then it is impossible to teach him to love others and live for them. 54 But, in the Indian context of Bharatiya Advaita, it was clear that integral humanism was the only way forward. Upadhyaya advocated national reconstruction on the basis of this philosophy. However, the duty of Indians was not only to protect their culture, but to make it dynamic and efficient. If we march ahead, Upadhyaya concluded, we will be able to place before the world ideals like nationalism, democracy, equality, and world amity in a balanced and integral form, along with permanent values in Bharatiya culture. When Deen Dayal Upadhyaya was expounding his political philosophy, he could not have foreseen the day that a political party claiming to be working in his name would govern with a crushing parliamentary majority. To what extent can they be said to have put his beliefs into practice? The proliferation of Deen Dayal Upadhyaya institutions and schemes is misleading. The prophet of the BJP has so far been honored in lip service rather than literally. In some senses, today's BJP leaders seem closer in spirit and conviction to the Hindu Rashtra of Savarkar and Golwalkar than to that of Upadhyaya. Not for them the partial generosity of acknowledging the place and role of the Muslims and Christians in the country. These are less tolerant men and women, one of the latter, after all, a minister in the Modi government, divided the nation into Ramzayed, believers in Rama, and Haramzayed, bastards. Point 55 Where Deen Dayal harked back to ancient India's generosity in offering asylum to Parsis and Jews. 56 Today's BJP government announces its determination to expel Rohingya Muslim asylum seekers. 57 Because they happen to be Muslim, and therefore ipso facto are assumed to constitute a threat to India's security. Where Upadhyaya denounced materialism and embodied the virtues of a simple village life, preached the abolition of large land holdings and spoke up for the humble peasant, his followers in power swear by GDP growth and fiscal balance, subsidize the multi-billion-pound ventures of capitalist cronies, sport imported designer sunglasses, wield Mont Blanc pens and wear the highest quality tailored linens. Their slogans are not about the poor in India's villages, nor about the sole force that animates this ancient civilization, but about ease of doing business and start-up India. Where Upadhyaya deplored materialism and extolled self-reliance, the men ruling in his name exalt figures of GDP growth and clamour for foreign direct investment. His injunctions against an excessive attachment to affluence and prabhav, or socio-economic distinctions, are ignored by rulers who crave the support of billionaires. Upadhyaya believed that after independence India lost its idealism, because by failing to create a Hindu Rashtra, it never recognized one grand uniting force to hold Indians together. It could be argued that for all its claims of supplying this force, Hindutva actually works by replacing hatred for the British with hatred for a minority, a formula that will result in division and destruction, not unity. I have often argued that we are all minorities in India, given our divisions of language, region, caste, and cultural practices. Recognizing and managing that diversity is a far better way of promoting unity than imposing one view on the rest, a method that will lead not back to a golden age but to certain disaster. The BJP and Hindutva. Following Upadhyaya's death and its rout in the elections of 1971, the Bharatiya Janata Sangh merged in 1977 into the Janata Party, which was born from the resistance of all opposition parties to Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's emergency. But when the Janata Party won the national elections which followed, its internal contradictions soon surfaced. Foremost among these was the dual membership issue, with many Janata Party members objecting to the continued involvement with the RSS of the former Bharatiya Janata Sangh politicians. The Janata Party split over RSS influence on its Sanghi elements, and the Bharatiya Janata Sangh members reconstituted themselves as the Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, in 1980, vowing allegiance to Gandhian socialism in an attempt to make themselves more appealing to the mainstream. The experiment with moderate political messaging failed. The BJP won just 2 seats in India's 545-member Lok Sabha in 1984. Disillusioned with this unsuccessful attempt at seeking political respectability by tempering its core beliefs, the BJP remade itself into an explicitly Hindu party, stirring up Hindu sentiment. The 1980s were a time of great ferment in Indian politics, with the Sikh separatist Khalistan movement at its peak, Assamese students rising in protest against Bangladeshi illegal immigrants who were transforming the demography of their state, Tamil separatism in neighboring Sri Lanka drawing India into the maelstrom, and a youthful but Westernist Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, seemingly running the country from a great height, like the airline pilot he had once been. The BJP sensed an opportunity to carve out a distinctive space for itself as a defender of Hindu interests. In a resolution adopted officially at Palampur in 1989, it declared Hindutva as its ideology while claiming that Hindutva represents cultural nationalism and embodies Indian nationhood, rather than a religious or theological concept. In the years following, the BJP established a distinctive Hindutva agenda in national politics, advocating Hindu causes, some which manifestly went beyond religion, like the rights of Kashmiri Pundits brutalized by Islamist terrorists and driven from their homes in the Kashmir Valley to become refugees in their own land, and some which directly challenged other religions, such as the advocacy of a uniform civil code to replace the personal laws of religious minorities. The Muslim threat presented itself in multiple ways: Muslim illegal migrants in Assam, reactionary Muslim conservatives opposing a liberal Supreme Court judgment in the Shah Bano case, in which the court's award of alimony to a Muslim widow was then overturned by the government passing a law obliging her to seek support from the Waqf board, and angry Muslim politicians denouncing Salman Rushdie's blasphemy in his novel, The Satanic Verses. To those repelled by such developments, the BJP offered not just negative condemnation but a positive alternative cause dear to many Hindu hearts: a campaign to resurrect a legendary ancient temple to the birthplace of Lord Rama, the Ram Janmabhoomi, which had reputedly stood on the site of a disused 16th century mosque, the Babri Masjid, in the North Indian holy town of Ayodhya. The evidence for this claim is contested, though there is little doubt that some temple had indeed stood there, since in 1975, well before the mosque's destruction, the Archaeological Survey of India, ACI, unearthed 14 pillar bases of Kazadi stone with Hindu motifs in the foundations. Yet, very few details are available about the temple or whether it had indeed been destroyed to construct the masjid. But there is no doubt it is deeply entrenched in popular Hindu belief that this precisely was where Rama was born and where he must be worshipped. If this can be achieved without inflicting pain on Indian Muslims, and while finding some way to make up for the barbarous destruction of the Babri Masjid, the nation will heave a sigh of relief. But a quarter century after the demolition of the masjid, the case pens in the Supreme Court, and the temple remains unbuilt, its absence a potent symbol for the Hindutva movement and a perennial vote winner for its acolytes. The Ram Janmabhoomi campaign was incendiary politics, given the inflammatory potency of calls to replace a mosque with a temple, but for the BJP, it worked. The party's leader, L.K. Advani, rode across the Hindi heartland in a converted truck decorated to look like the chariot of an ancient Hindu warrior, making fiery speeches all the way. Hindu groups were exhorted to fire and consecrate bricks in every village in a Ramshila Pujan, prayer ritual, and proceed with them to Ayodhya for use in the temple that would one day be built there. Pilgrimages were organized to Ayodhya to look at the spot where Hindus had to swallow the mortal insult of a holy site being occupied by a mosque. As emotions reached fever pitch, a howling, frenzied mob broke the 470-year-old mosque apart in December 1992, leveling it to rubble while the police stood idly by. 58 The BJP had made its mark. But while these two incidents tower above the others in the Hall of Infamy, the forces unleashed by Hindutva have led to numerous acts of violence in its name, and not only against non-Hindus. From the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi by Nathuram Godse in January 1948 for being too sympathetic to Muslims, to the murder of journalist Gauri Lankesh in September 2017 for her excoriating attacks on the Sant Parivar, moderates, liberals, and rationalists of Hindu background have also been targeted. It is distressing that there are BJP MPs who have publicly called for Gandhi's statues to be supplanted by those of Godse to commemorate his killing. The catalogue of communal violence and riots, incited mainly by Hindutva organizations, is long and dismaying. Several erupted in 1964, 1965, and 1967, in places where Hindu refugees from the former East Pakistan were settled, notably Rourkela, Jamshedpur and Ranchi, where Hindu organizations exploited the refugees' tales of suffering to ignite communal passions and incite violence. The Bharatiya Jana Sangh's resolution on the Indianization of Indian Muslims played a role in the Ahmedabad riots in 1969, while the Shiv Sena's Army of Shiva, a Mumbai-based Hindu right-wing organization supported by Marathi speakers, communal agenda helped spark those in Bhiwandi Jalgaon in 1970. The 1980s saw thousands of Muslims being killed in riots, starting with Moradabad in 1980 and carrying on through the horrors of Bihar Sharif, Meerut, Bhiwandi, and Baroda to the massacre at Nellie in Assam and a slew of riots around the Ramshila Pujan agitations to consecrate bricks in towns across northern India to rebuild the Ram Janmabhoomi. The 1990s, following the demolition of the Babri Masjid, witnessed what many have described as the worst riots of post-independence India in Mumbai, Surat, Ahmedabad, Kanpur, Delhi, and elsewhere. And of course, unrelated to Hindutva, India also suffered the grotesque anti-Sikh riots of 1984, when mobs egged on by some leaders affiliated with the ruling Congress, and claiming to be revenging the assassination of Indira Gandhi by her Sikh bodyguards murdered 2,800 innocent Sikh civilians across India, including 2,100 in Delhi. Since the ascent of the BJP to power, the forces unleashed by the dominance of Hindutva have resulted in many incidents of violence. In one grim reckoning, more than 50 individuals have been killed in anti-minority acts of violence since mid-2014, and dozens of others stripped, beaten, and humiliated. Particularly haunting is the story of 15-year-old Junaid Khan, returning home on a crowded train after buying new clothes for ID, who was stabbed repeatedly because he was Muslim and thrown off the train to bleed to death on the tracks. Specific cases related to cow vigilantism are discussed later. Headlines have spoken continually of riots and killing, Hindu against Muslim, of men being slaughtered because of the mark on a forehead or the absence of a foreskin. The politics of division. There are essentially two kinds of politics in India, the politics of division and the politics of unity. The latter has increasingly been taken for granted, and so the former has by far the greater momentum, as politicians seek to slice and dice the electorate into ever smaller configurations of caste, language, and religion, the better to appeal to such particularist identities in the quest for votes. But this resort to violence is a new low in our political life. The attacks on Muslim and, earlier, Christian families, the vandalism of their places of worship, the destruction of homes and livelihoods, and the horrific rapes, mutilations, and burnings alive that have occurred, have nothing to do with religious beliefs, neither those of the victims nor of their attackers. They are instead part of a contemptible political project whose closest equivalent can in fact be found in the Islamist terrorism the Hindutva supporters claim to despise, the bomb blasts in Mumbai in January 1993 and the Indian Mujahideen terrorist attacks in Delhi, Jaipur, and Ahmedabad, in which bombs were said to go off in hospitals, marketplaces, and playgrounds. 59 The actions of both Hindu and Muslim terrorists are anti-national, both aim to divide the country by polarizing people along their religious identities, and both hope to profit politically from such polarization. India must not let either set of terrorists prevail. By 1996 the BJP had emerged as the largest single party in national elections, though the unwillingness of the secular parties to ally with it had led to the collapse in 13 days of its first attempt at forming a government. 2 years later it was back, with an amiable conciliator, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, heading a coalition government in 1998. Though one more election intervened, this government lasted 6 years. The BJP, despite merely heading a coalition government, left no doubt about its ideological moorings, installing a plaque to honor Savarkar at the Andaman Central Jail where he had been imprisoned, while avoiding all mention of the obsequious letter of apology to the British that had won him his release. Describing himself as a prodigal son longing to return to the parental doors of the government, despite the failure of his earlier letter of clemency in 1911 to obtain him a pardon, Savarkar wrote again on November 14, 1913. If the government in their manifold beneficence and mercy release me, I for one cannot but be the staunchest advocate of constitutional progress and loyalty to the English government, which is the foremost condition of that progress. As long as we are in jails, there cannot be real happiness and joy in hundreds and thousands of homes of His Majesty's subjects in India, for blood is thicker than water, but if we are released, the people will raise a shout of joy and gratitude to the government, who knows how to forgive and correct, more than how to chastise and avenge. 60. Savarkar went on to add, moreover, my conversion to the constitutional line would bring back all those misled young men in India and abroad who were once looking up to me as their guide. I am ready to serve the government in any capacity they like, for as my conversion is conscientious, so I hope my future conduct would be. By keeping me in jail, nothing can be got in comparison to what would be otherwise. The mighty alone can afford to be merciful and, therefore, where else can the prodigal son return but to the parental doors of the government? The parental doors of the BJP government were certainly thrown open to Savarkar. His behavior towards the British rulers was airbrushed from official accounts of his life. A hagiographic biopic was released in 2001, and his portrait was even hung in Parliament's Central Hall, deliberately positioned to face that of Mahatma Gandhi. During BJP rule at the head of a coalition government in Delhi, a purely BJP government, headed by a fiery and articulate ideologue, Chief Minister Narendra Modi, ruled Gujarat. It was on this government's watch that 1,000 to 2,000 people, mainly Muslims, were massacred in 2002, in a pogrom against that community that blighted the state's normally tranquil capital, Ahmedabad, and other places in Gandhi's homeland. The chief minister was accused of condoning the killings or at the very least not taking prompt action to stop them, which ceased only after the army was called in 3 days after they began. It was reported that Prime Minister Vajpayee wanted to dismiss him for his failure to prevent the massacre, but was dissuaded by the Hindutva hardliners in his administration. 61. Senior BJP leader Venkaiah Naidu confirmed this story on the record as an example of his party's democratic decision-making. According to Naidu, Prime Minister Vajpayee wanted Modi to resign as Gujarat Chief Minister after the 2002 riots, but had to give in to the party's collective decision against the idea. Be that as it may, the Gujarati public rallied behind him. Modi was re-elected as Chief Minister of Gujarat in elections later that year, 2002, and returned to office again with ever larger majorities in 2007 and 2012. While his campaign rhetoric vehemently expressed Hindutva ideas, he also claimed to be governing effectively and promoting robust economic development, a message that resonated well beyond his state and gave him a credible national reputation for decisive and impactful leadership. This in turn propelled him to the position of the BJP's candidate for Prime Minister in 2014, and to a resounding victory in the general elections held across India that year. Under Prime Minister Modi, the BJP has a sizable parliamentary majority on its own that it had never enjoyed before. It is, therefore, not obliged to dilute its agenda to accommodate less Hindutva-minded coalition partners, since it does not need any of them to make up its majority. The BJP became the first governing party in the history of independent India to come to power without a single elected Muslim member of the Lok Sabha. The 3 Muslims who have served in its Council of Ministers are all appointees to the Rajya Sabha. Also, for the first time, Indian democracy finds itself facing the reality of its top 3 constitutional positions: President, Vice President, and Prime Minister, all being held by RSS members of the same ideological disposition. It is difficult to escape the conclusion that this marks a significant step towards the Hindutva project of transforming India into a Hindu state, or at least a state with a distinctively Hindu identity. Many Hindutva ideologues have long deplored the fact that love for Hinduism had been, in India, a love that could not be acknowledged. Officially promoted secularism, they argued, had made India a country where a Muslim could be proud to be Muslim, a Christian proud to be Christian, a Sikh proud to be Sikh, while a Hindu was proud to be secular. The groundswell of rage that anchors this perception takes in a host of factors: the uncritical acceptance by the Indian establishment of regressive practices among the Muslim community while demanding progressive behavior from Hindus, the support for minority education while denying such aid to Hindus, the promotion of family planning among Hindus but not among Muslims, the cultivation of vote banks led by conservative Muslim leaders but the disparagement of their Hindu equivalents, and so on. The result is a widespread denunciation of the appeasement of Muslims, which seems bizarre when one looks at the statistical evidence of Muslim socio-economic backwardness and the prevalence of discrimination in such areas as housing and employment. Muslims are underrepresented in the nation's police forces and overrepresented in its prisons. Yet Hindutva leaders have successfully stoked a perception that government benefits are skewed towards minorities, and thus justified their campaign for Hindu self-assertiveness. The unapologetic assertion of Hindutva, and its unabashed capture of the political pinnacle of authority in the land, thus represented a dramatic shift in India's political culture, whose implications are yet to be fully parsed. Many Indian social scientists have described the Hindutva movement as fascist in the classical sense of the term. Marxist social scientist Prabhat Patnaik, for instance, is a prominent advocate of the argument that the Hindutva movement is classically fascist in class support, methods, and program. 62 Patnaik and others find the following elements of classical fascism present in Hindutva: its attempt to create a unified homogeneous majority defined as the Hindus, its sense of grievance against past injustice, especially by Muslim rulers, its sense of cultural superiority and affirmation of the timeless truths embodied in Hinduism, its interpretation of history in the light of its grievances against past oppressors and its faith in the superiority of its own tenets, its rejection of all arguments against such an interpretation of history, and its appeal to a religious and cultural Hindu majority articulated in terms of race and masculinity. He could have added the frequent and easy resort to majoritarian mob violence against helpless members of minority faiths, occurring with increasingly troubling frequency in recent years. Well before Modi became Prime Minister, the sociologist Ashish Nandy had described him as an archetypal fascist, a classic, clinical case of a fascist. 63. However, it must be said that Modi has not conducted himself in office in the manner Nandy's analysis would have suggested. He has repeatedly spoken of being a prime minister for all Indians. Arguably his most effective slogan has been Sab Ka Saath, Sab Ka Vikas, together with everyone, development for all. Nor can it be denied that the ascent of Hindutva supporters to the pinnacle of political power in India has occurred, significantly, under India's secular constitution, and through entirely democratic and legal means. The great question before us today is, therefore, will constitutionalism tame Hindutva, or will Hindutva transform the workings of the Constitution? On December 11, 1995, a three-judge bench of the Supreme Court, headed by a famously liberal Chief Justice, J.S. Verma, declared that Hindutva was a way of life and not a religion. The court explained, ordinarily, Hindutva is understood as a way of life or a state of mind and is not to be equated with or understood as religious Hindu fundamentalism. It is a fallacy and an error of law to proceed on the assumption that the use of words Hindutva or Hinduism per se depicts an attitude hostile to all persons practicing any religion other than the Hindu religion. It may well be that these words are used in a speech to promote secularism or to emphasize the way of life of the Indian people and the Indian culture or ethos, or to criticize the policy of any political party as discriminatory or intolerant. 64. Unsurprisingly, this Supreme Court judgment found its way into the campaign manifesto of the BJP in the general elections of the following year, 1996. The party claimed the Supreme Court had endorsed the true meaning and content of Hindutva as being consistent with the true meaning and definition of secularism. This could be said to mark the beginning of the constitutional acceptability of the concept of Hindutva, something that arguably is no longer in question, since on January 2, 2017, the Supreme Court of India declined to reconsider its 1995 judgment, so the Constitution and its custodians have made their peace with Hindutva. But can Hindutva wholeheartedly accept the Constitution? The more conformist of the two BJP prime ministers India has had, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, in office from 1998 to 2004, took a moderate approach to constitutional change, arguing that even in the mightiest fort one has to repair the parapet from time to time, while VP Singh cautioned that the tenants should not go for rebuilding in the name of repairs. 65. His rule saw no dramatic change in India's constitutional arrangements, though his government did conduct a constitutional review that produced a 1,979-page report, universally unread. There has so far been no dramatic challenge to the constitution under the second BJP Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, either, but here it is far less certain that the present approach will endure. Deen Dayal Upadhyaya, who rejected the Constitution of India in conception, form, and substance, would be astonished to find his supposed acolytes extolling its every line and holding special commemorations in Parliament with grandiloquent speeches to mark the anniversary not just of its adoption, which, after all, is Republic Day, but even of its passage by the Constituent Assembly in a newly anointed Constitution Day. What would Upadhyaya have made, I wonder, of a Prime Minister, who swears by him, saying that this constitution, the very document that Upadhyaya found fallacious, westernist, and devoid of Chiti and Virat Shakti, is his holy book? It is, of course, difficult to know whether we should take the Hindutvaadi's claims to be admirers of the present secular, liberal, Western-influenced Constitution of India to be as sincere as their professions of devotion to Upadhyaya. Will Modi and his tribe, after consolidating their hold on both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, and after taking over most of the state governments, feel emboldened to tear up the very constitution to which they have so far so enthusiastically pledged allegiance? There are already hints that the constitution in its present form cannot long survive unscathed. Hindutva ideologue K. N. Govindacharya has declared that the constitution must be transformed. Amendment is a short-term goal while rewriting is a long-term objective, he stated. 66 His fundamental critique, expressed in interviews to leading Indian newspapers in 2017, is not far from Upadhyaya's of half a century earlier. Our constitution is based upon the idea of individualism. It promotes individualism, which is against the Indian value system, while Indian civilization is based upon family system, collectiveness. Other important components of our society such as caste system, panchayat system are not mirrored in the constitution. Individualism is a Western idea. It cannot be the basis of the Indian constitution. A new constitution should be written which would talk in favor of sarva, all, not an individual. Aside from giving caste an honored place in the Hindutva political system, we believe that Indian society and its cultural reality should be included in the constitution. For instance, in Bharatiya society, family is the basic brick of society, and as in the Cuban constitution, it is not the individual but family values that are crucial. Cuba as a model for India is a nice touch from a supposedly right-wing movement. But as in many communist systems, parliament as we know it would cease to exist. The new constitution would be based on the principles of collectiveness. In political terminology, you can call it a guild system. Representatives of the different castes, professions, communities would be included in National Guild. Instead of the upper house, Rajya Sabha, and lower house, Lok Sabha, of Parliament, there would be only one National Guild in which 1,000 representatives from all over the country will discuss the problems of India. In the National Guild, 500 representatives would come through territorial representation, while 500 would come through functional representation. Human rights are another example of the westernization of the Indian constitutional system. According to Govindacharya, there cannot be any rights without checks and balances. If the Constitution gives us fundamental rights, it mentions fundamental duties too. But no one cares about that. Rights and duties should be seen in relation to each other. To exercise your rights, you should follow your duties. No one can exercise absolute freedom. As Deen Dayal Upadhyaya had argued, fundamental duties, not just rights, must also be incorporated. Secularism, like human rights, will have to go. It implies opposition of Hindus and appeasement of Muslims or other minorities. We should get rid of this word as soon as possible. It is completely irrelevant in the Indian context. Deen Dayal Upadhyaya's inspiration crops up again in the Hindutva rejection of the Western word socialism in the preamble of the Constitution. We have a better word of Indian tradition to express the spirit of socialism. It is Upadhyaya's coinage Antyodaya. Antyodaya means Antimayadmai, the last man. Similarly, democracy is a troubling term because it implies political contention. Instead of competitiveness, consensus and collectiveness should be the spirit of the democracy, says Govindacharya. 67 Shades of Cuba again. The process of incorporating such Hindu concepts seems to have begun. We are doing it very silently. Discussions and debates have been taking place for some time. What I told you above are the initial outcomes of the debate, Govindacharya confirms. There may be many gaps which need deliberations, and a cool, calm, dispassionate discussion needs the right atmosphere and a mechanism. However, this is just not possible in the media glare. Would a Hindutva-inspired revision of the Constitution, for example, move the issue of cow slaughter from the directive principles of the Constitution, where it is linked specifically to the preservation of milch cattle and scientific principles of animal husbandry, to somewhere more binding, and anchored more explicitly to religious sanction? Govindacharya is clear. A Hindutva drafted constitution would provide for ecocentric, not anthropocentric development. I mean not just rights of the cow, but a holistic view of Zamin, Jal, Janwar, jungle land, water, animal, jungle, for only in this protection lies the well-being of man. All the five must have sacred rights, and this should not just be rights-based but duty-based, and not just be components of state power. The cow is part of our civilizational past and it reflects those values. It should be a civilizational continuity in the preamble. The cow, environmental protection, all this requires constitutional protection. It is part of Hindu ethos, culture like Bishnois who embrace death by hugging those trees. This is all Bharatiya culture. Instead of assuming man is conqueror of nature, it is the duty of humans to protect nature, and all this must be incorporated in the Constitution. Environmentalists may well approve, but the key question remains whether a Hindutva modified constitution, assuming that it ever comes to pass, will retain the core principle of independent India, that all adult Indians are deemed equal, irrespective of religion. Or would it consciously embrace the central theme of Hindutva, which would discriminate against non-Hindus? If it did so, it would be true to Hindutva as expounded by Savarkar, Golwalkar, and Upadhyaya, but not to the Hinduism of Swami Vivekananda or Mahatma Gandhi, who did not define citizenship or Indianness in terms of the gods one worshipped, what one ate, the way one dressed or where one went for pilgrimage. But if it did not do so, it would betray a century's worth of political philosophising in the name of Hindutva, surrendering its tenets to the dominant nationalist stream it had long derided as pseudo-secular. This will be a crucial dilemma for the Hindutva ideologues. Do they take the opportunity given to them by their crushing political majority, which might not endure if they wait too long, to remake the Constitution as their principal thinkers had advocated? Or do they accept that the reality of ruling a multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious polity makes the goal of Hindutva unattainable? Another litmus test would lie in whether a revised Hindutva constitution would mandate a uniform civil code for all the citizens of India. Leaders subscribing to Hindutva have long argued that differential laws based on religion, essentially the personal laws governing marriage, inheritance, and divorce for Muslims, and also for other religious minorities, violate Article 44 of the Indian Constitution and have sowed the seeds of divisiveness between different communities. If we are all Hindus, albeit Hindu Muhammadans, Hindu Christians and so on, why should we not all be subject to one civil code? Secular Congress leaders from Jawaharlal Nehru onwards have argued that while a uniform civil code might be a desirable objective, it could only be adopted with the consent of the affected communities. This could not be obtained by pressure or by legal coercion, it required persuasion. Since minority leaders, especially Muslims, showed no inclination to be persuaded, seeing a uniform civil code as the imposition of majoritarian Hindu sensibilities, the idea needed to be deferred indefinitely, until the time was ripe. Hindutva leaders have long mocked this approach as caving into minority prejudices. Accepting Sharia law, they argue, violates the human rights principles of gender equality by discriminating against Muslim women and allows unelected and in some cases self-appointed religious personalities to interpret religious dictates and so lay down the law. Could they now concede the permissibility of religious personal laws without losing credibility? And would a Hindutva constitution preserve the anomaly of Article 370, which grants a special status to the state of Jammu and Kashmir, to the extent that no law passed by the Parliament of India can apply to that state without being also passed by the Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir? Would the advocates of Hindutva allow the state to continue to restrict land holding to state subjects, a status a woman would lose if she married a man from outside the state? India's constitutionalists have long argued that it is a living document, susceptible to amendment in keeping with the evolving demands of time, subject of course to judicial interpretation, which has decreed that its basic structure cannot be tampered with. Would transforming an egalitarian and secular constitution into a document infused with the principles of Hindutva not violate its basic structure? And yet, can the advocates of Hindutva, the intellectual legatees of Savarkar, Golwalkar, and Upadhyaya, afford not to try, a travesty of Hinduism? While not everything in the philosophy I have sought to summarize is objectionable and there is much to admire, for instance, in Upadhyaya's humanistic thinking there is much that is troubling too. By rejecting the territorial idea of the nation in favor of an abstract ethos of patriotism, it excludes many who belong on the territory of modern India and are loyal citizens but feel differently about Bharat Mata, Mother India. In its emphasis on cultural authenticity and allegiance to ancient Indian traditions and beliefs, it risks alienating those who do not share these assumptions. While extolling the virtues of harmony and cooperation, it sows the seeds of further division by setting those who subscribe to these values against those who for reasons of religion, politics, or intellectual conviction do not. And in dismissing minority appeasement but requiring minorities to accept Hindu ways of being as their own, it offers no real solution to the undeniable reality that 20% of India's population are not Hindus and cannot be expected to conform to Hindu ideas of how they should live and what they should believe. It also ignores, in its desire to portray a Hindu vision, the diversity within Hinduism itself. The faith is practiced differently by people in different parts of the country, or worshipping different manifestations of the divine, or adhering to different castes or sects. Even the Brahmins, who are spread throughout the country and are associated everywhere with learning, priestly functions, and religious erudition, manifest diversity in their social practices. While the Malayala Brahmins grow their tuft of hair at the front, most Orthodox Tamil Brahmins wear it at the back, where Iyengar Brahmin women regard white as the color of widowhood, the Namboothiri Brahmin bride wears white at her wedding. As we have seen, Hinduism is not a totalizing faith. Each Hindu may have a different conception of her own dharma. Integral humanism undoubtedly emerges from a close and sustainable reading of Advaita philosophy, but Upadhyayas is not the only way of being Hindu, and other sages and rishis may offer alternative approaches to the same conundrums. Upadhyaya's philosophy suffers the demerit of its own certitudes. It is unable to accommodate dissent. Some have seen in his approach a reaction to Islam's assertiveness. In response to the suggestion that Hindus are behaving like Islamists, the one-time journalist and former BJP minister Arun Chori commented tartly, "In a word, three things are teaching the Hindus to become Islamic: the double standards of the secularists and the state, the demonstrated success of the Muslims in bending both the state and the secularists by intimidation, and the fact that both the state and the secularists pay attention to the sentiments of Hindus only when the Hindus become a little Islamic. My forecast: the more the secularists insist on double standards, the more Islamic will the Hindus become." What does this Islamicist Hinduism of the Sant Parivar consist of? The ideological foundations laid by Savarkar, Golwalkar, and Upadhyaya have given members of the RSS a fairly coherent doctrine. It rests on the atavistic belief that India has been the land of the Hindus since ancient times, and that their identity and its identity are intertwined. Since time immemorial, Hindutva advocates argue, Hindu culture and civilization have constituted the essence of Indian life. Indian nationalism is therefore Hindu nationalism. The history of India is the story of the struggle of the Hindus, the owners and custodians of this ancient land, to protect and preserve their religion and culture against the onslaught of hostile alien invaders. It is true that the territory of India also hosts non-Hindus, but these are invaders, Muslims, Christians, or guests, Jews, Parsis. They can be tolerated, depending on their loyalty to the land, but cannot be treated as equal to the Hindus unless they acknowledge the superiority of Hindus in India and adopt Hindu traditions and culture. Non-Hindus must acknowledge their Hindu parentage, or, better still, convert to Hinduism in a return to their true cultural roots. Those political forces in India who are opposed to the Sant's ideology are mistaken, the doctrine goes on, since they make the cardinal error of confusing national unity with the unity of all those who happen to be living in the territory of India, irrespective of religion or national origin. Such people are in fact anti-national, because their real motivation is the selfish desire to win minority votes in elections rather than care for the interests of the majority of the nation. The unity and consolidation of the Hindus is therefore essential. Since the Hindu people are surrounded by enemies, a polarization must take place that pits Hindus against all others. To achieve this, though, Hindus must be unified. The lack of unity is the root cause of all the evils besetting the Hindus. The Sant Parivar's principal mission is to bring about that unity and lead it to the greater glory of the Hindu nation. The problem with this doctrine, coherent and clear though it is its denial of the reality of what Hinduism is all about. What Swami Vivekananda would have seen as the strength of Hinduism, its extraordinary eclecticism and diversity, its acceptance of a wide range of beliefs and practices, its refusal to confine itself to the dogmas of a single holy book, its fluidity, the impossibility to define it down to a homogeneous Semitic creed, is precisely what the RSS ideologues see as its weakness. The Sanghivadi quest for polarization and unity is also a yearning to make Hinduism what it is not, to Semitize it so that it looks like the faiths of the invaders, codified and doctrinaire, with an identifiable God, preferably Rama, a principal holy book, the Gita, a manageable ecclesiastic hierarchy, and of course a unified race and a people to profess it. This is not the lived Hinduism of most Hindus. And so the obvious question arises, must every believing Hindu automatically be assumed to subscribe to the Hindutva project? And since manifestly most do not, does the viability of the project require a continued drive to force the dissenters into the Hindutva straitjacket? Whereas Hinduism is an inward-directed faith, focusing on self-realization above all and the union of the soul with the Absolute, Hindutva is an outward-directed concept, aimed at creating social and cultural distinctions for a political purpose. Hindutva, therefore, is disconnected from the central assumptions and tenets of my Hinduism. Yet it piggybacks on the faith, claiming to represent Hinduism, though it does so not as a set of doctrines or precepts but as a cultural marker. Hindutva adopts the Hindu religion not as a way of seeking the divine but as a badge of worldly political identity. This has little to do with the Hinduism of Vivekananda, or of Adi Shankara. It is a 20th century idea, born of 20th century forms of political thinking that were already beginning to be dangerously out of date elsewhere in the world when they were propounded in India. Parties professing to speak for an entire people or vote were discredited as well as destroyed in Europe in 1945. 7 decades later, the idea flourishes in India, in the name of Hindutva. Speaking for myself, any attempt to reduce my Hinduism, which sits comfortably with the Nehruvian notion of Indianness, to a sectarian notion of Hindutva is a travesty of what Hinduism really is. I too, as a Hindu, can say, when people tell me Garv sek ho ki tum Hindu ho, that I am proud to be a Hindu, but in what is it that we are to take pride? I take pride in the openness, the diversity, the range, the lofty metaphysical aspirations of the Vedanta, of the various ways in which Hinduism is practiced, eclectically, and of its extraordinary acceptance of differences. Unfortunately, as I have noted, the votaries of Hindutva seem to take pride in Hinduism the way in which one might support a football team as a badge of identity, rather than as a set of values, principles, and beliefs, and so Hinduism becomes reduced in their retelling to little more than a label on a t-shirt, a badge of allegiance rather than a way of relating to the cosmos. My notion of Indianness and Hinduness is very much caught up in what Dr. Radhakrishnan so memorably spoke of as a view of life. That view of life has very little room for intolerance, for dogma, for attacks on others because of what they do or do not believe. I am a Hindu, and I am a nationalist, but I am not a Hindu nationalist. My nationalism is unquestioningly, all-embracingly, Indian. The song does not speak for Hindus like me. 6. Beyond holy cows, the uses and abuses of Hindu culture and history. My own faith in religious pluralism is a legacy of my upbringing in secular India. Secularism in India did not mean irreligiousness, which even avowedly atheist parties like the Communists or the Southern DMK, Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, Dravidian Progress Federation, party found unpopular amongst their voters. Indeed, in Calcutta's annual Durga Puja, the communist parties compete with each other to put up the most lavish puja pandals, Hindu religious displays. Rather, secularism meant, in the Indian tradition, a profusion of religions, none of which was privileged by the state. I remember how, in the Calcutta neighborhood where I lived during my high school years, the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer blended with the chant of the mantras and the tinkling of bells at the nearby Shiva temple and the crackling loudspeakers outside the Sikh Gurudwara reciting verses from the Guru Granth Sahib. And just around the corner was St. Paul's Cathedral. As we have seen, the irony is that India's secular coexistence was paradoxically made possible by the fact that the overwhelming majority of Indians are Hindus. That acceptance of difference, which I have explored in this book and elsewhere, characterized the Hinduism propagated by Vivekananda and other visionary Hindu seers. This meant that it came naturally to Hindus to coexist with practitioners of other faiths. In a plural society, religious pluralism was merely one more kind of difference everyone accepted, just as we knew that around us were people who spoke different languages, ate different foods, dressed differently and had different shades of skin color from ours. Secularism and syncretism. Secularism in India, therefore, did not mean separation of religion from state. Instead, secularism in India means a state that was equally indulgent of all religious groups, and favored none. Nor did it mean secularity in the French sense, or laicide. The French concept keeps religion out of governmental institutions like schools and government out of religious institutions in turn, whereas Indian secularism cheerfully embraces financial support to religious schools and the persistence of personal law for different religious communities. The Indian system has created incentives for various religious denominations to start and operate minority schools and colleges with substantial government funding, impart religious education, and be exempt from various regulations and stipulations the Indian government imposes on non-minority institutions. Critics, especially of the Hindutva variety, do not hesitate to point out that while government schools and colleges may not impart religious instruction, religious sects and charities affiliated to minority communities may open their own schools and receive state financial assistance even as they impart religious indoctrination. Secularism of secularism, the government's financial largesse is extended to the Muslim Waqf boards, Buddhist monasteries, and certain Christian religions, and under a 1951 Religious and Charitable Endowment Law, state governments are empowered to take over, own and operate Hindu temples, collect revenue from offerings and redistribute that revenue to such purposes as it deems fit, including any non-temple related ones. This may well be worth re-examination. Still, it came as a shock when, in 2016, the BJP government invited a Jain monk to address the Haryana State Assembly, seating him in an exalted position above the Speaker of the House. Many Hindus saw this as a grave mistake. Religiosity is hardly unknown in our politics. There are several saffron-robed sadhus who have been elected to parliament, and one, Yogi Adityanath, serves as the chief minister of India's biggest state, Uttar Pradesh, but giving an unelected religious figure a position of prominence in an elected, representative democratic legislative body was fundamentally wrong, and crossed a line that had hitherto never been breached. While the Haryana government's actions might have been unconscionable, there is no getting away from the fact that India is not secular in the commonly understood sense of the word. What it is pluralist, an overwhelmingly Hindu majority country running political and governmental institutions that promote the survival, success, and perpetuation of religious minorities. It is the idea that rather than distancing itself from religion, the idea of Dharmanirpekshata condemned by the critics of secularism, the state can embrace all religions. My generation grew up in an India where our sense of nationhood lay in the slogan, unity in diversity. We were brought up to take pluralism for granted, and to reject the communalism that had partitioned the nation when the British left. In rejecting the case for Pakistan, Indian nationalism also rejected the very idea that religion should be a determinant of nationhood. We never fell into the insidious trap of agreeing that, since partition had established a state for Muslims, what remained was a state for Hindus. To accept the idea of India, you had to spurn the logic that had divided the country. In some ways, this kind of Indian secularism has ancient roots in our history. Admired monarchs from Ashoka, in the 3rd century BCE, to Harsha, in the 6th century CE, gave their recognition and patronage to different religions. Ashoka's Rock Edict 12 forbade people from honoring their own sects at the expense of others, and condemning the beliefs of others. Citizenship and political status in his state were never linked to one's religion. The coexistence of religions is evident from the fact that the Ellora cave temples, some Jain, some Hindu, and some Buddhist, were carved next to each other between the 5th and 10th centuries. While this traditional approach to secular or pluralist practice was not that of the Islamic kingdoms that established themselves from the 12th century onwards, even Muslim rulers bound to uphold the less welcoming tenets of their faith had to reconcile themselves to ruling an overwhelmingly non-Muslim populace and accommodating prominent Hindus in government and the military. One monarch, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, went so far as to create his own syncretic religion, Din-e-Ilahi, to meld the best features of Islam, Hinduism, and the other faiths of which he knew into a new national faith. It did not outlast his reign, but the attempt was extraordinary. The concept of Sarva-dharma Samhava, accepting the equality of all religions, was propounded by great Hindu sages like Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, as we have seen, and upheld by Mahatma Gandhi and the Indian nationalist movement. While it was an axiomatic tenet of the post-independence India in which I grew up, Sarva-dharma Samhava has been increasingly rejected by some proponents of Hindutva who spurn the notion of religious universalism in favor of a more robust assertion of Hindu cultural identity and Hindus' political rights. The Hindutva ideologue David Frawley, Pundit Vamadeva Shastri, for instance, warns against Sarva-dharma Samhava, arguing that only Hindus are asked to practice this belief, which simply leads to confusion and does not convince the opponents but deludes the Hindus themselves. Frawley asks, when have Christians or Muslims in India ever been criticized for violating Sarva-dharma Samabhava? Under the guise of religious tolerance, this idea of equality of religions is used to prevent scrutiny of others' religious dogmas. Point 1. Yet the lived reality of Indian syncretism is difficult to deny. Hindus who made the arduous uphill trek to the cave temple of Amranath in northern Kashmir, where an ice lingam, a naturally formed stalactite, is worshipped, would have known that a third of their offerings went to the family of Adam Malik, a Muslim shepherd who, it was said, found the cave 4 centuries ago and led a Hindu sadhu to see the astonishing sight. In my novel, Riot, I wrote of Syed Salome Sut Ghazi, popularly known as Ghazi Mayan, a Muslim warrior who is worshipped as a saint by Hindus in the Bareilly area of Uttar Pradesh. A number of Muslim religious figures such as Nizamuddin Aulia, Moinuddin Kishti, Shah Madar, and Sheikh Nazaruddin, alias Chirag-i Dili, are also worshipped by Hindu devotees to this day. Even the richest Hindu temple, at Tirupati, has a Muslim connection. One legend has it that Lord Balaji's second wife is Muslim, Bibi Nankira, the daughter of a sultan who was enamored of the Lord, much to her father's dismay, until Balaji appeared in the sultan's dreams and informed him that he wished to marry his daughter. The sultan, overwhelmed, acquiesced, and today Balaji's second wife is said to live in the town below, at his feet, while his first wife Padmavati resides on Tirumala hill, at the temple, in his heart. Such stories are not uncommon in India. A Muslim goddess, Banbabai, is worshipped in idol form as the protector of the mangrove forests adjoining the Bay of Bengal. The Nawabs of Audit celebrated the annual Ram Leela and Krishna Leela. Nawab Wajid Ali Shah, who was to be deposed by the British, personally directed a Krishna Leela performance in which he asked his begums to dance the parts of the gopis. The Nawabs of Audit both established and patronized the Hanuman festival in Lucknow known as Bada Mangal. In Bengal, Muslim Pachua painters specialized in painting the Hindu epics on long pieces of craft paper. And as I have mentioned earlier, Hindus are regular worshippers at Christian shrines like the Basilica of Our Lady of Good Health in Velankanni or Mount Mary Church in Mumbai, and in Kerala's Ambalapuzha, an image of Saint Thomas used to be carried in procession to the Krishna temple on festive occasions, alongside those of Krishna and associated Hindu divinities. Stories abound of different communities habitually working together in pre-colonial times on issues that benefited principally one. For instance, Hindus helping Muslims to rebuild a shrine, or Muslims doing the same when a Hindu temple had to be reconstructed. Devout Hindus were sometimes given Muslim names and were often fluent scholars in Persian. Muslims served in the army of the Maratha, Hindu, warrior King Shivaji, as did Hindu Rajputs in the forces of the fiercely Islamist Aurangzeb. The Vijayanagara army included Muslim horseback contingents. At the village level, many historians argue that Hindus and Muslims shared a wide spectrum of customs and beliefs, at times even jointly worshipping the same saint or holy spot. In Kerala's famous pilgrimage site of Sabrimala, after an arduous struggle up to the hilltop shrine of Lord Ayyappa, the devotee first encounters a shrine to his Muslim disciple, Vavar Swami. In keeping with Muslim practice, there is no idol therein, merely a symbolic stone slab, a sword, Vavar was a warrior, and a green cloth, the color of Islam. Muslim divines manage the shrine. In another astonishing example, astonishing since it is both anachronistic and syncretistic, a temple in South Arcot, Tamil Nadu, hosts a deity of Muttal Rabuttan, a Muslim chieftain complete with beard, kumkum, and toddy pot who protects Draupadi in the Mahabharata. Note, of course, that Islam did not exist when the Mahabharata was composed, but in post-Islamic retellings, a Muslim chieftain has entered the plot. Indians of all religious communities had long-lived intertwined lives, and even religious practices were rarely exclusionary. Thus Muslim musicians played and sang Hindu devotional songs, Hindus thronged Sufi shrines and worshipped Muslim saints there, and Muslim artisans in Benares made the traditional masks for the Hindu Ram Leela performances. Northern India celebrated what was called a Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, a syncretic culture that melded the cultural practices of both faiths. The renowned scholar Romila Thapar has recounted how deeply devotional poetry was written by some poets who were born Muslim but worshipped Hindu deities, notably Sayyid Ibrahim, popularly known as Ras Khan, whose dohas, couplets, and bhajans, hymns, dedicated to Lord Krishna were widely recited in the 16th century. The Mughal court, she points out, became the most impressive patron of the translation of many Sanskrit religious texts into Persian, including the epic Mahabharata, translated as the Rajnama, and the Bhagavad Gita, with Brahmin priests collaborating on the translations with Persian scholars. To Gyanendra Pandit, such tales, as well as parables of Hindu generals in Mughal courts, or of Hindu and Muslim ministers in the Sikh ruler Ranjit Singh's entourage, suggests there was fuzziness about self-conscious identities and a lack of self-definition on the basis of religion, or even of caste, within both the Hindu and Muslim populations. These stories do not suggest mutually incompatible or hostile ideologies. The reality of syncretism runs deep into social practice. Muslim artisans create the masks for the major Hindu festival of Dussehra in the holy city of Varanasi. The Ram Leela could not be performed without their work. Muslim Patachitra painters sing and paint pads, scrolls, about Hindu divinities. And among the most famous exponents of Hindu devotional music are the Muslim Dagar brothers, not to mention the Baul singers, a legacy of the Bhakti tradition, who sing Sufi-inspired folk songs in praise of a universal God. Muslim sociologists and anthropologists have argued that Islam in rural India is more Indian than Islamic, in the sense that the faith as practiced by the ordinary Muslim villagers reflects the considerable degree of cultural assimilation that has occurred between Hindus and Muslims in their daily lives. The late Muslim reformist scholar Asghar Ali Engineer once wrote that rural Islam is almost indistinguishable from Hinduism except in the form of worship. The degree may vary from one area to another, but cultural integration between the Hindus and Muslims is a fact which no one, except victims of misinformation, can deny. One of the most striking images of India that went around the internet in recent years was a photograph of a Muslim couple on Janmashtami Day setting out on their scooter, the man with a beard and skull cap, the woman in all-encompassing burqa, taking their child to act in a school performance, and this Muslim boy was dressed as Krishna, complete with kiritam, peacock feather, blue-hued skin, and flute. Sadly, some Hindu chauvinists have distorted the basic tenets of their own religion as described in the preceding chapters to propagate a version of the faith in opposition to other religions, especially Islam and Christianity. Worse, this violent, extremist brand of Hinduism, which has no sanction in Hindu scriptures, theology, or practice, appears to be gaining ground in recent times, with the covert or active assistance of many Hindutva-inclined politicians, religious leaders, and groups. The two worst examples of these affronts to the spirit of Hinduism in modern times are undoubtedly, as I have mentioned, the demolition of the Babri Masjid in December 1991 by a howling, chanting mob of fanatics, and the massacre of innocents, mainly Muslims, in Gujarat in 2002. What have we come to, that a land that has been a haven of tolerance for religious minorities throughout its history should have sunk so low? India's is a civilization that, over millennia, has offered refuge and, more importantly, religious and cultural freedom to Jews, Parsis, Muslims, and several varieties of Christians. Christianity arrived on Indian soil, or so legend has it, with St. Thomas the Apostle, Doubting Thomases, who is said to have come to the Kerala coast sometime before 52 CE and was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. He made many converts, so there are Indians today whose ancestors were Christian well before any European discovered Christianity, and before the forebears of many of today's Hindu chauvinists were even conscious of themselves as Hindus. One of the oldest mosques in the world outside the Arabian Peninsula is also in Kerala, in Kadungalur. The India where the Muezzin's prayer and the Pujari's mantra coexist is an India of which we can all be proud. But, as we know, there is also the India in which murderous mobs in Odisha sought to kill Christians and destroy their places of worship and homes, pulled down the Babri Masjid, conducted the pogrom in Gujarat and lynched Mohammed Akhlaq and Palakan more recently. Tragically, the cycle of violence goes on, spawning new hostages to history, ensuring that future generations will be taught new wrongs to set right. We live, Octavio Paz once wrote, between oblivion and memory. Memory and oblivion, how one leads to the other, and back again, has been the concern of much of my writing. Today we are facing people who wish to wipe out memory, and supplant it with new memories of their own invention. As I pointed out in the last words of my novel Riot, history is not a web woven with innocent hands. But as this book is about Hinduism, what sticks in my craw is the claim of the perpetrators of such violence that they are acting in defense of my faith. Hinduism believes that there are various ways of reaching the ultimate truth. To me, the fact that adherents of this faith, in a particular perversion of its tenets, have chosen to take human life and destroy somebody else's sacred place in its name, to kill others because of the absence of a foreskin or lack of a mark on the forehead, this ultimately makes me, as a Hindu, deeply sorrowful and, in a very fundamental way, ashamed. As I have shown throughout this book, how, after all, can such a religion lend itself to fundamentalism? That devotees of this supremely tolerant faith have assaulted Muslims and Christians in its name is particularly galling. As we have seen, Hinduism has survived the Aryans, the Mughals, the British. It has taken from each language, art, food, learning and outlasted them all. Muslim invaders destroyed Hindu temples, putting mosques in their place, but this did not make India a Muslim land, nor did Hinduism suffer a fatal blow. Survival is the best revenge, rather than reprisal. Undoing the wrongs of a different era through new wrongs in a different context only compounds the original sin, an eye for an eye, as Mahatma Gandhi famously said, makes the whole world blind. Large, eclectic, agglomerative, the Hinduism that I know understands that faith is a matter of hearts and minds, not bricks and stone. Build Ram in your hearts is what Hinduism has always enjoined. If Ram is in your heart, it would matter very little where else he is, or is not. How does it matter, then, what bricks or stones Ram can also be found in? Living with people of various kinds of faith, Hindus developed their tradition of acceptance of difference, but also understood that in both principle and practice, religion and politics should be divorced. Our founding fathers, the majority of whom were Hindus, decided that India was not a Hindu Pakistan, and the vast majority of Indians took pride in that assertion. where Pakistan reserved its top constitutional positions only for Muslims, and stamped non-Muslim on the passports of its minority citizens in confirmation of their second-class status, Indians reveled in the prominence enjoyed by its various minorities in public life. Neither politics nor governance, and certainly not culture, sport, or entertainment, was based on religious principles, and success in no field required a litmus test of faith. Throughout the decades after independence, the political culture of the country reflected these secular assumptions and attitudes. Though the Indian population was 80% Hindu and the country had been partitioned as a result of a demand for a separate Muslim homeland, 3 of India's 11 presidents were Muslims, so were innumerable governors, cabinet ministers, chief ministers of states, ambassadors, generals, and Supreme Court justices. During the war with Pakistan in 1971, when the Pakistani leadership was foolish enough to proclaim a jihad against the Hindu unbelievers, the Indian Air Force in the northern sector was commanded by a Muslim, Air Marshal, later Air Chief Marshal, I.H. Latif. The army commander was a Parsi, General, later Field Marshal, S.H.F.J. Manekshaw. The general officer commanding the forces that marched into Bangladesh was a Sikh, General J.S. Arora, and the general flown in to negotiate the surrender of the Pakistani forces in East Bengal was Jewish, Major General J.F.R. Jacob. They led the armed forces of an overwhelmingly Hindu country, that is India, Hindu nationalism. So the idea of India is of one land embracing many. As I have written before, it is the idea that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, costume, and custom, and still rally around a consensus. That consensus is around the simple principle that in a diverse democracy you don't really need to agree except on the ground rules of how you will disagree. The reason India has survived all the stresses and strains that have beset it for 70 years, and that led so many to predict its imminent disintegration, is that it maintained consensus on how to manage without consensus. But the 20th century politics of deprivation has eroded Indian culture's confidence. As we have seen, Hindu chauvinism has emerged from the competition for resources in a contentious democracy. Politicians of all faiths across India seek to mobilize voters by appealing to narrow identities, by courting votes in the name of religion, caste, and region. They have urged voters to define themselves on these lines. As religion, caste, and region have come to dominate public discourse, to some it has become more important to be a Muslim, a Bodo, or a Yadav than to be an Indian. For Hindutva thinkers, the principles of tolerance and acceptance are emasculating. It is no longer enough for Hindus to be apostles of tolerance with no clear principles or doctrines with which to sustain it, argues Frawley. They must stand for the truth, which cannot always be popular, and not simply seek to placate everyone. Point 2 But their truth is built on the denial of the truths that Hindus have lived by for millennia. This is why the development of what has been called Hindu fundamentalism and the resultant change in the public discourse about Indianness is so dangerous. The suggestion that only a Hindu, and only a certain kind of Hindu, can be an authentic Indian, is an affront to the very premise of Indian nationalism. An India that denies itself to some of us could end up being denied to all of us. The reduction of non-Hindus to second-class status in their homeland is unthinkable. It would be a second partition, and a partition in the Indian soul would be as bad as a partition in the Indian soil. But the roots of such thinking run deep in the ideology of Hindutva, and that is a cause for alarm for all concerned Hindus. Hindutva, or as some would prefer to call it, Sanghibad, the beliefs and philosophy of the Sant, to strip it of its religious connotations, is in many ways a distraction from the real issues facing the country: poverty and economic development, oppression and injustice, the evolution of our still imperfect democracy. Identity politics becomes a diversion from the bread and butter, or dal and roti, issues that actually affect most Hindus. As discussed in Chapter 5, the Hindutva project involves an attempt to create an overarching political ideology that would subsume all the adherents of a highly differentiated and eclectic religious faith. Accordingly, the idea of Hindu nationalism conflates ideas of religion and culture with those of nation and state. Nationalism is by definition indivisible, whereas religion and culture take on multiple manifestations. Culture, of course, contributes to national identity, yet culture alone cannot mold the nationalism of a country, let alone that of a plural land like India. In India during colonial rule, the reassertion of Indian culture was a nationalist project, which witnessed the revival of dance forms like Bharatanatyam and traditional classical music, as well as modern literature in Indian languages, modern art, from Raja Ravi Verma to the Bengal school, and painters like Hussain who derived inspiration from the Indian epics, and what evolved into the gaudy cinema of Bollywood. But an India confident in its own cultural diversity could celebrate multiple expressions of its culture. Hindutva sees culture differently. As Gulwalkar wrote, culture is but a product of our all-comprehensive religion, a part of its body and not distinguishable from it. For Hindutva's devotees, India's national culture is Hindu religious culture, and cultural nationalism cloaks plural India in a mantle of Hindu identity. Since Hindutva's conception of nationalism is rooted in the primacy of culture over politics, the historian K. N. Panikkar has pointed out, the Hindutva effort is to create an idea of the Indian nation in which the Hindu religious identity coincides with the cultural. As David Frawley explains, after being ruled by West and East Hindus for many decades after independence, today, Hindus are rediscovering their roots. This movement is not simply a regressive return to medieval Hindu values, but a rediscovery of the validity and importance of Hindu culture and spirituality for both the future as well as the past. It includes discovering the importance of Hindu yoga, Vedanta, Ayurveda, Vedic astrology, classical Indian art and culture, and the Hindu view of society and government. Point 3. What he calls the Bharatiya spiritual urge, he says, after extolling yoga and meditation, did not arise from the suppression of other human urges but from a full flowering of human nature in all aspects, including the arts and the sciences. This we see lavishly embodied in Indian music and dance, mathematics, and medicine. This sounds reasonable enough, except when he adds that Hindus must learn to project a united front and reclaim the greater field of Hindu Dharma that covers all aspects of life and culture. Point 4. This call for unity replaces variety with uniformity and dissent with dogma, a notion of Hindu Dharma that is all-encompassing and covers all aspects of life and culture has no room for difference or for heterodoxy, let alone for deviance. But the Hindu religious identity exalted by Hindutva ideologues is defined in narrow terms. The inclusive Hinduism propagated by the thinkers whose views I explored in the first 4 chapters of this book is not the Hinduism of the Sant Parivar. Vivekananda, Dayanand Sarasvati, Aurobindo, and Mahatma Gandhi are ostensibly revered, but their paeans to inclusivity are glossed over or ignored. The Hindutva premise, in Panikar's words, is that national regeneration and resurgence would require the recreation of an authentic culture by reclaiming the indigenous and purging the exogenous. Hindutva's cultural project, encoded in the slogan Nationalise and Spiritualize, therefore, is twofold. First, to retrieve and disseminate the cultural traditions of the golden Hindu past, and second, to eliminate all accretions that had become part of the Heritage Five. The former project, of digging up ancient glories of the past, is well underway. The latter is proceeding somewhat fitfully and episodically. We will examine both processes below, starting with the battles being fought over history. One of the amusing, but nonetheless important, sidelights of the development of Hindutva theory has been the controversy about the origins of the Aryans. The Hindutva approach inevitably had implications for the commonly accepted narratives about India, including the idea that the Indo-Aryan people had migrated to northern India from the Central Asian steppes sometime around 1500 BCE and authored the foundational texts of Hinduism, the Vedas. Golwalkar believed that was impossible. Hinduism, he was convinced, was an indigenous faith that grew from rather than put down roots in Indian soil, and so the Indo-Aryans could not possibly have come from elsewhere. His and Savarkar's idea of India being the Punyabhumi of the Hindus required the Aryans to be indigenous to India, in contrast to India's Muslims, whose faith clearly originated in the Arabian Peninsula. A veritable cottage industry was born of RSS-inclined historians debunking the Aryan migration theory, insisting that the Aryans, as the founders of Hinduism, belonged all along to India. Some less ideological scholars point out that the Rig Veda does not speak of any other land but northern India or Aryavarta. In her Sacred Plants of India, Dr. Nanditha Krishna shows how every plant and animal mentioned in the Rig Veda originates from this area. This leads some to the conclusion that the Aryans could not have come from anywhere else. But the same textual and vegetal evidence could also suggest that while the Aryans came from elsewhere, they only composed the Vedas after having created a settled civilization in the Indo-Gangetic plains, which is why their allusions are all to India. Unfortunately for the Hindutva ideologues, who seem to be winning the historical battle, recent genetic research published in a paper, in a peer-reviewed journal called BMC Evolutionary Biology, by Professor Martin P. Richards and 15 other scientists, titled A Genetic Chronology for the Indian Subcontinent points to heavily sex-biased dispersals has confirmed that there were indeed significant migrations from the Central Asian steppes into the Indian subcontinent, starting from around 2000 BCE, 1500 BCE. 6. DNA studies show that the Indo-Aryan ethno-linguistic group has a higher signature of Central Asian genes than the corresponding Dravidian speakers, and given that Indo-Aryan languages have close affinities with the larger Indo-European linguistic family, it appears beyond dispute that a common proto-language was involved. The implications for the Savarkar-Golwalkar theory, though, are subversive, since they suggest that Hinduism or the Vedic religion may itself have originated with invaders from outside India, making it as un-Indian in its origins as Islam or Christianity. The conclusions are sufficiently tentative to fall short of conclusive. One critical analysis concludes that it is difficult to deduce the direction of haplogroup R1, a migration either into India or out of India, although the genetic data certainly show that there was migration between the regions. 7 The advocates of Hindutva continue to insist the Indo-Aryans and their faith are indigenous to India, but DNA evidence may prove impossible to refute. Much of the dispute seems to center not around whether there were infusions from abroad but as to whether they occurred 12,000 years ago or 4,000 to 3,500 years ago. If the first hypothesis is right, the resulting population was indigenous well before they composed the Vedas. The latter suggests a shorter gap between their arrival in India and the emergence of Hinduism. To me this seems a distinction without a difference, but then I am much more comfortable with the idea that migrations into the subcontinent have been a permanent feature of Indian history than the Hindutva brigade is. In fact, the Hindu Pallava kingdom even imported a monarch from Southeast Asia. When King Parmeshwaravarman died without an heir in c. 731 CE. A Pallava princess had been given in marriage to the Cham dynasty generations earlier, and it was presumed one of her descendants could carry on the royal lineage. Accordingly, a delegation of nobles was sent to the Cambodia, Vietnam region and returned with a 14-year-old boy, who ruled for 64 years as King Nandavarman II, reigned c. 731 to 795 CE, and built a number of magnificent temples, including the famous Vaikunth Perumal in Kanchipuram. Hinduism has been strengthened by its imports too, Hinduism and science. Similar battles are being waged over other kinds of intellectual terrain, with Hindu nationalists insisting upon recognizing the glories of ancient Indian thought and long-neglected ancestral accomplishments, notably in science. There is definitely a case for enhancing the Indian public's awareness of the genuinely impressive accomplishments of their forebears, of which more below, rather than remaining schooled in a colonial-era Westernist view of the world. But the uncritical, indeed fantasy-laden, manner in which its Hindutva aficionados have advocated the cause has only discredited it. The dominance of the BJP at the center and in the states has propelled a number of true believers of Hindutva into positions of unprecedented influence, including in such forums known as the Indian Council for Historical Research, the University Grants Commission, and, it turned out, the Program Committee of the Indian Science Congress, which scheduled a talk on Vedic aviation technology in 2015 that elicited howls of protest from many delegates. It has also given a license to unqualified voices who gain in authority from their proximity to power. The 2018 statement by India's Junior Education Minister, Satyapal Singh, that Darwin's theory of evolution was unscientific on the grounds that no one has ever seen an ape turn into a man drew attention to the latest challenge posed to modern India by its current government. Earlier, another BJP stalwart, Rajasthan's Education Minister Vasudev Devnani, had dealt science another body blow by claiming that the cow is something of an obsession for the BJP, whose followers have assaulted human beings in the name of cow protection, but this was a step too far even for many of its sympathizers among the educated public. The two ministers are educated men. Satyapal Singh is a chemistry graduate, and Vasudev Devnani is a trained engineer. Whether their statements reveal the quality of science education in India, or merely confirm that Hindutva ideology trumps both scientific fact and common sense, neither learning nor governmental office appears to insulate either man from ignorance. No greater proof of this can be found than the Prime Minister himself. Narendra Modi likes to be portrayed as a technology-friendly 21st century leader, but on October 25, 2014, Modi startled the world at the inauguration of a Mumbai hospital with the claim that the elephant-headed Hindu god Ganesh was proof of ancient India's knowledge of plastic surgery. He went on to cite the ancient epic, the Mahabharata, as confirming that people then were aware of genetic science. That the smallest imaginable elephant head cannot possibly fit into the largest available human neck does not appear to have occurred to the Prime Minister, whose fatuous claim discredited ancient India's genuine scientific accomplishments. Such ideas, because they are patently absurd, except in the realm of metaphor, have embarrassed those who advance them as well as those who cite them in support of broader, but equally unsubstantiated, claims to past scientific advances from genetic science to cloning and interstellar travel and the use of nuclear devices, by the philosopher sage Kanada in the 1st century BCE. Petty chauvinism is always ugly, but never more so than in the field of science, where knowledge must be uncontaminated by ideology, superstition, or irrational pride. India was indeed the world pioneer in plastic surgery. It produced the world's first known surgeon, Susruta, and archaeologists have found the world's oldest surgical instruments, dating from the 1st century, in India. There is evidence for rhinoplasty operations in the ancient texts. But the moment these historical facts were subsumed in a narrative about mythological transplanted elephant heads, the actual facts were discredited. This was not the Prime Minister's only offense. Before heading off for the Paris climate change negotiations, Modi told school children on Teachers' Day in 2014 that climate change was a myth because it was actually human beings whose capacity to cope with heat and cold has changed, rather than the environment. Global warming, he explained on national television, is just a state of mind. What made it worse was that this came as an answer to a school child's question about climate change. That's because as you grow older you are less able to withstand heat and cold. The climate isn't changing, he said, we are. The disease is catching. On May 31, 2017, Justice Mahesh Chandra Sharma of the Rajasthan High Court, reportedly a science graduate himself, suggested to the Union of India that the cow be declared the national animal and that cow slaughter be punished with life imprisonment. In an interview to a television channel, Justice Sharma later told the nation that India's national bird, the peacock, is a lifelong celibate who does not indulge in sex but impregnates the peahen by shedding a tear. He cited Lord Krishna's use of a peacock feather as proof of its celibacy. The idea of a peacock reproducing through tears may seem laughable, but there is nothing lachrymose about the ruling dispensation's dominant Hindutva ideology, which has helped propagate an astonishing amount of pseudoscience across the country. The gaggle of gurus who have made religion into a hugely successful business in India have inevitably joined the party. Modi associates like the yoga teacher and Ayurveda entrepreneur Baba Ramdev are regular offenders. Ramdev pronounces his pseudo-spiritual wisdom to the world, seeking, for instance, to sell medicines to cure homosexuality. Others assert, with some level of official encouragement, that the ancients had already discovered or invented every scientific accomplishment in the Vedic age, including jet aircraft, pushpak viman, and atomic weaponry. The underlying message is that ancient India had all the answers, and that traditional and indigenous practices and ways of life are vastly better than imported modern scientific ideas. But the controversy also discredits the modern rationalists who, in their contempt for such exaggerated and ludicrous claims, also dismiss the more reasonable propositions pointing to genuine Indian accomplishments by the ancients. It is not necessary to debunk the genuine accomplishments of ancient Indian science in order to mock the laughable assertions of the Hindutva Brigade. Separating the reasonable from the absurd is a necessary condition of well-founded criticism. A BJP government choosing to assert its pride in yoga and Ayurveda, and seeking to promote them internationally, is, to my mind, perfectly acceptable. Not only are these extraordinary accomplishments of our civilization, but they have always been, and should remain, beyond partisan politics. It is only if the BJP promoted them in place of fulfilling its responsibility to provide conventional health care and life-saving modern allopathic medicines to the Indian people, that we need object on policy grounds. But when the national manifesto of the BJP for the 2009 general election claimed that in ancient times, rice yields in India stood at 20 tons per hectare, twice what farmers can produce today using intensive agriculture in the most fertile and propitious conditions imaginable, all one can do is to throw one's hands up in despair. On the other hand, in asserting, in his own speech to the Indian Science Congress, that ancient Indians anticipated Pythagoras, science and technology minister Dr. Harshvardhan was not incorrect and should not have been ridiculed. In fact, he could have added Newton, Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo as well, every single one of whom had been beaten to their famous discoveries by an unknown and unsung Indian centuries earlier. The Rig Veda asserted that gravitation held the universe together 24 centuries before the apple fell on Newton's head. Scholars working in Sanskrit anticipated his discoveries of calculus by at least 250 years. The Siddhantas are amongst the world's earliest texts on astronomy and mathematics. The Surya Siddhanta, written about 400 CE, includes a method for finding the times of planetary ascensions and eclipses. The notion of gravitation, or Gurutvakarsan, features in these early texts. Lost Discoveries, by the American writer Dick Tracy, a comprehensive study of the ancient non-Western foundations of modern science, spells it out clearly. 200 years before Pythagoras, writes Tracy, philosophers in northern India had understood that gravitation held the solar system together, and that therefore the sun, the most massive object, had to be at its center. 10. Aryabhata was the first human being to explain, in 499 CE, that the daily rotation of the earth on its axis is what accounted for the daily rising and setting of the sun. His ideas were so far in advance of his time that many later editors of his awe-inspiring Aryabhata altered the text to save his reputation from what they thought were serious errors. Aryabhata conceived of the elliptical orbits of the planets 1,000 years before Kepler, in the West, came to the same conclusion, having assumed, like all Europeans, that planetary orbits were circular rather than elliptical. He even estimated the value of the year at 365 days, 6 hours, 12 minutes, and 30 seconds. In this he was only a few minutes off. The correct figure is just under 365 days and 6 hours. The translation of the Aryabhata into Latin in the 13th century taught Europeans a great deal. It also revealed to them that an Indian had known things that Europe would only learn of a millennium later. The Vedic civilization subscribed to the idea of a spherical earth at a time when everyone else, even the Greeks, assumed the earth was flat. By the 5th century CE, Indians had calculated that the age of the earth was 4.3 billion years. As late as the 19th century, English scientists believed the earth was 100 million years old, and it is only in the late 20th century that Western scientists have come to estimate the earth to be about 4.6 billion years old. India invented modern numerals, known to the world as Arabic numerals because the West got them from the Arabs, who first encountered them in India. It was an Indian who first conceived of the 0, Shunya, the concept of nothingness, shunyata, integral to Hindu and Buddhist thinking, simply did not exist in the West. Modern mathematics would have been impossible without the zero and the decimal system. Just read a string of Roman numbers, which had no zeros, to understand their limitations. Indian mathematicians invented negative numbers as well. The concept of infinite sets of rational numbers was understood by Jain thinkers in the 6th century BCE. Our forefathers can take credit for geometry, trigonometry, and calculus. The Bakshali manuscript, 70 leaves of bark dating back to the early centuries of the Christian era, reveals fractions, simultaneous equations, quadratic equations, geometric progressions, and even calculations of profit and loss, with interest. The Sulba Sutras, composed between 800 and 500 BCE, demonstrate that India had Pythagoras' theorem before the Great Greek was born, and a way of getting the square root of 2 correct to 5 decimal places. Vedic Indians solved square roots in order to build sacrificial altars of the proper size. The Kerala mathematician Neelkuntha wrote sophisticated explanations of the irrationality of pi before the West had heard of the concept. The Vedanga Jyotisha, written around 500 BCE, declares, like the crest of a peacock, like the gem on the head of a snake, so is mathematics at the head of all knowledge. India's mathematicians were poets too. Hindus also invented the Katapiyati system, also known as Paralpiru in Malayalam. In an age without paper and climatic conditions that tended to destroy records, this was a method where numbers could be transcribed as words or even verses. The idea that mathematical formulas could be written down as meaningful sentences helped preserve and perpetuate mathematical expertise in the country. Indian numbers probably arrived in the Arab world in 773 CE with the diplomatic mission sent by the Hindu ruler of Sindh to the court of the Caliph al-Mansur. This gave rise to the famous arithmetical text of Al-Khwarizmi, written around 820 CE, which contains a detailed exposition of Indian mathematics, in particular the usefulness of the zero. It was Al-Khwarizmi who is credited with the invention of algebra, though he properly credits Indians for it. But the point is that, alas, India let this knowledge lapse. The reverence for the past that is integral to the ruling ideology is also reflective of a fear of rejecting the past, since the promotion of a faith-based communal identity is central to the Hindutva project, and faith is seen as emerging from the timeless wisdom of the past. Traditionalism benefits those who want to uphold the social order, ensure discipline and conformity, and prevent radical change. Science and rationality threaten such conformism. This is why the ruling dispensation's political project of transforming secular India into a Hindu state requires the supremacy of religion over science. Religion is no longer just a question of your personal beliefs, a form of stretching out your hands to the divine. It is part of the assertion of a politics of identity built around faith. This requires an assault on science, since science challenges the established verities as religion does not. When an education minister questions Darwin or asserts the miraculous powers of the cow, he is not merely offering a choice between a scientific theory and a faith-based one. He is reminding the public of their allegiance to a total worldview. That worldview embraces a larger political project that prescribes a set of beliefs and behaviors incompatible with science, skepticism, and inquiry. We had a glorious past. Wallowing in it and debating it now will only saddle us with a contentious and unproductive present. Indians should take pride in what our forefathers did but resolve to be inspired by them rather than rest on their laurels. We need to use the past as a springboard, not as a battlefield. Only then can we rise above it to create for ourselves a future worthy of our remarkable past. The BJP is still bent on creating a Hindu state in India. Sadly, this would not be the kind of Hindu state that has made India the scientific superpower of the ancient age, but one plunged in obscurantism and atavistic complacency. It is enough to make one shed a tear. One can only hope that there are no peahens around. Hint.